Now.
All right, and I'll let people know that we're recording.
This is great.
Yay. Awesome. I'm going to repeat myself a few times, but welcome everybody. If you could start putting into the chat that your name, your title, and the organization you're from. So Roger, our speaker today, knows who he's speaking to. And if you could mute yourself, that would be great. Great. Thanks for filling up that chat. So again, welcome. If you haven't already, please put your name, organization, and title in the chat so our speaker, Roger, knows who we are. And also, we are recording this, so it will be posted later if you'd like to watch it again. And there was a few people who wanted to attend who couldn't. So, being recorded.
Well, I would like to say first, Casey, condolences to the Evans family.
If you have not muted yourself, if you could mute yourself, that would be great. I'm going to go through, and if somebody is not muted, I'm going to mute you. And all right, we're good. So there's already 29 people here, which is great. And more people coming as 30. Okay, so again, this is being recorded. Put your name, title, organization in the chat. And I think we'll just get started right away. So this is the quarterly meeting of the Stewardship Roundtable. You probably all know that, so I'm not going to repeat myself. But thanks all for coming. Thanks to Roger Latham for being today's speaker, and thanks to Duke Farms for funding a stipend for this April speaker program for the past several years, and also providing the Zoom for us today. Jeff, do you want to say a couple words about Duke before we kind of get into the meeting?
Sure. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Geist. I see a lot of familiar faces. It's good to see all of you. I'm programs coordinator at Duke Farms, and we're just really excited to be able to offer this and do it on our Zoom account. So we have the expanded cloud, so it'll be saved there, and we'll send it out to everyone once it's over if you wanted to go back to it and watch. So it's really great to see all of you, and I won't take up too much time. So we'll just jump right in. You guys can get started.
All right, so we're going to let more people kind of find their way to the meeting before we have Roger speak. So what I wanted to do was I've been seeing the Google group lighting up with jobs and opportunities. So let's take a couple minutes. If anybody has any grants, programs, opportunities, especially at the professional level, something that you think the group would be interested in. Of course, now we have wider access to things further away since we're doing a lot of things remotely. And so again, grants, programs, opportunities, hiring, at your organization, let us know. I saw something come in this morning from Audubon, I think for educational, seasonal. So feel free to unmute yourself and let us know what's going on with your organization. All right, on that exciting note, a lot going on out there. Come on, guys. There's
Rachel? Rachel?
Yes, Leslie.
Oh, hi. Well, if stuff like that isn't going on, I would like to make people aware that there's a bill in the New Jersey Assembly as well as the Senate calling for requiring forest stewardship plans on all land with Green Acres money that has more than 25 acres of forest. I think it should be vigorously opposed. Forest stewardship plans have nothing to do with restoration. And to do this to every single forest, municipal land trust would be absolutely catastrophic. Rachel, I could send you the comments from the Highland Coalition about this. There are also 3 associated bills. One, for example, that eliminates the option for any municipality or anybody else to have any say in the matter. Only DEP would approve or disapprove of forest stewardship plans. It also, a 4th bill requires burning 50,000 acres in the pinelands and 10,000 acres somewhere else. And while I'm a big supporter of prescribed burning, like, where do the numbers come from? What do they have to do with? Nothing is justified in these 4 bills.
Leslie, yeah, you can send that either to me or to the roundtable group
Just I can see to
directly.
the group in general.
Yeah, and if you want to sort of digest some comments on each, that would be great. And if you need some help getting, links to the bills and things like that, just let me know and we'll get that out to the group. So when people have been commenting on this, where are comments coming pro and against?
Basically, people are commenting to the assembly or to the senators, to the group in general. And you can write individually to the members or to the, the entire assembly or senate. But that information will be included in the email. And in fact, there's a 5th bill that showed up because people were complaining that this is an unfounded mandate since you have to pay for all of these. So Dancer has introduced a bill that would take the money from the, I think it's the Climate Adaptation Committee or whatever. There's money that's been allocated to adapting to climate change. So instead, we're going to chop down a bunch of trees and dramatically reduce our carbon storage in the name of healthy forests. That's what it's called, healthy forests.
Leslie, do you
Mhm.
do you know the origin, like who's behind these bills?
Actually, it's been going on for 10 years. Green Acres, as you know, was protected from logging till Christie. So 50 years of logging on private land and no logging on public land. And Christie opened that up. Most of it's being done under the cover of habitat management. But like they've just stripped hundreds of acres out of Sparta Mountain in the name of young forest, This bill or variations of it, this is the 5th time it's come up since 2010. I could give you all kinds of other bill numbers, 1054, et cetera. It's been shot down every time. This time it's back again. I do think that New Jersey Audubon's heavily involved, but and I also think a lot of people think this is good. They've bought into the healthy forests. that thinning is needed to, well, the Forest Action Plan for New Jersey says it's a carbon defense strategy. It is not. It dramatically reduces both capture and storage. So it's hard to say.
Does anybody else want to comment on these bills? Okay. So thanks for keeping us informed, and yeah, send that along,
I
and
will.
people can look at the comments and the bills and see what they want to do about it.
Leslie, is there not to start the whole conversation, I guess, and
We could take the whole meeting.
yeah, but I mean, just one quick thought is like, is there any hope that forest stewardship plans can be more, attentive to rare species and such?
Well, I spent months at the committee meetings for setting up the rules for forest stewardship plans. And all of that was very much rejected, out of hand. One, on the grounds that it was too much to ask of private landowners, but now we're applying it to public lands. We asked that ecologists be involved, or at least allowed to write the plans. And of course, now we have certified ecological restoration practitioners through SIR. I think they should be allowed to do these plans, but that was thoroughly rejected, only foresters. And there's nothing about anything but trees. And if it's on the state's list of threatened and endangered, it gets recognized, but nobody looks for it. It's assumed those are the only ones in the state.
Okay. Thanks, Leslie. Appreciate that. Does anybody else have anything they want to bring to the table before we start?
I just want to add too that I think a lot of nonprofits and even some counties like Morris are doing really good work. And this would just kick them right out of the process altogether. The Conservation Foundation, doing work on its own land, that's out, not allowed anymore. It's the Forest Stewardship Plan.
All right, guys. I think we're up to 37. If you haven't already, please put your name and your organization and your title
I'm one of these
in the
people.
chat. Okay. So I think we'll get going. One last thing is the Google group, anybody who's a member can post. So you have a job opportunity, something related to stewardship, again, like grants, jobs, programs, a question about something going on your land, bills like the ones that Leslie is talking about, anything relevant to stewardship and restoration, you can post that yourself. I don't need to do it for you. If you post it and you don't see it come up, it may mean that for some reason you're a moderated user on the Google group. If you don't see it pop up like within an hour to the group, send me an email directly and I'll make sure to change your status to allow you to post no matter what. It's just a little background thing. It's no big deal. Also, at the bottom of every email, there's a reminder of when our meetings are. Again, they're quarterly, typically the second Tuesday of starting in January, and then quarterly throughout the year from 9:30 to noon. Sometimes that does change, but generally that's when it is. And if you forget, you can always look at the bottom of any of the emails. And with all that kind of business stuff out of the way, I'm going to mute myself and have Roger Latham introduce himself. We're really glad that you're here and you have a interested audience, Roger. So thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks, Rachel. This is a great turnout. And even before I introduce myself, I just wanted to ask Leslie and other people may know as well, whether there's a movement in New Jersey to establish something similar to Pennsylvania's Environmental Rights Amendment to the Constitution. Sounds like it's going to be a real hard sell with your assembly, but it's really doing some good here in our state, and a few other states, very few, have one. And I know there's a big movement in many states to establish one. And it's a long-term process, so the sooner the better. Do you know, Leslie, if that's underway? That's all right. I'll just introduce myself. I like to say that I've been in the conservation, biology, ecology field working in it for ever since the Endangered Species Act was passed, which is probably before at least half of you were born, in 1973. So I have 40 odd years, 50, I don't know, of work in this field. And I've had a bunch of careers. I'll just name a couple of them. I was a grad student at Penn, got a PhD in biology, did a postdoc in the geology department at Penn in fire ecology and biogeochemistry. And I was director of science and stewardship for Pennsylvania's Nature Conservancy chapter for a while. And I was a professor at Swarthmore College for a while. And for the last 21 years, I've been independent researcher, independent consultant, doing almost 100% work for landowning conservation organizations and agencies. I should say land managing, wild land managing. So the Nature Conservancy, Natural Lands, the New York and Pennsylvania Departments of Conservation, the various other agencies and nonprofits that have big areas of land that they need endangered species restoration work done on, or community restoration work done on. So with that, I will share my screen and we'll start talking about today's subject, which is Serpentine Barrens. I know New Jersey doesn't have any, but New Jersey has a lot of barrens and similar communities. And I hope some of what I'm going to talk about today is transferable to what you do at your job, each of you, and also just interesting from a scientific standpoint. My talk is going to cover, whoa, there we go, a little bit of background on serpentine grassland ecosystems, some of the stewardship challenges, which are major, some of my research and results, and the applications of those research results to restoration and maintenance, what we've learned over the past. Well, I've been studying serpentine barrens actually since 1981. As an undergrad, I did a couple of theses on serpentine barrens and have been fascinated ever since. So I don't know how many have heard about serpentine barrens. If I were live and I were in the same room with y'all, I would ask you to raise your hands. I wish there were a Zoom equivalent, but serpentine barrens are anything but barren. They consist of serpentine savanna, which is a grassland with trees, serpentine gravel forb communities, and we're actually renaming that. I should have renamed it on this slide, serpentine rock outcrop gravel communities, which have more than just forbs on them, serpentine seeps, and serpentine pine oak forests. Then they're surrounded by matrix forest. And notice the serpentinite on this diagram is colored green. Well, it actually is a green rock, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So here's an example of what a serpentine oak savanna looks like. The dominant species are generally little blue stems, pretty much dominant everywhere. We have lots of Indian grass and big blue stem as well. and prairie dropseed, which is most serpentine barrens are in Maryland and Pennsylvania that I'm going to talk about. So these species names at the bottom will indicate what status they have in those two states. So prairie dropseed is endangered in Maryland and endangered in Pennsylvania. It's an extreme disjunct. It's actually common in Nebraska and the Dakotas and further west, but this is an island of its presence here in the east. There's another species that's rare in the region, but common on serpentine barrens. And again, Sideoats grama actually lives not only in serpentine barrens in our region, but also on dry limestone-based prairies. We have 4 native oak species that are characteristic of serpentine barrens, and you're all familiar with them because they're extremely characteristic of pine barrens. Blackjack and post oak are 2 of them. The other 2 are the shrubby oaks. This is what a serpentine pine oak savanna looks like. This is what it looks like when it's inhabited by Dwayne Estes, who's the director of the Southeastern Grasslands Initiative, which is a major project throughout the Southeast to recognize special grassland communities. And Dwayne and his cohorts have been kind enough to give Pennsylvania honorary status as a Southeastern state, partly because of the serpentine barrens. We also have pitch pine in the barrens. And here are little snapshots of the various, here I got the name right, Serpentine Gravel Rock Outcrop Community. Very rich, even though the plant life is sparse, very rich in terms of species. This is a serpentine seep. And this is a typical serpentine forest with an average size ecologist for scale. The dominant in the understory is generally common greenbrier. Very low diversity, actually. So why are they called serpentine? Why are these barrens called serpentine? Well, the bedrock is serpentinite, and it's actually quite carvable into very nice carvings, and it's named after snakes, and I'm not going to tell you why right now, but if you're curious, you can ask later. And there was used in the region here in southeastern PA and northeastern Maryland for years as a building stone. This is College Hall at the University of Pennsylvania. There's a bunch of buildings that are made out of it. It turned out not to be a real good building stone. It doesn't have good bearing weight, load-bearing weight, load-bearing characteristics. The original design for this building had a campanile like in St. Mark's in Venice, and when they got a little ways up on the campanile, the bottom rocks started crumbling, so they had to change the design real quick. Here's what it looks like. It comes in various forms, some more pretty than others. So let me tell you a little bit about how serpentinite came to be. It's why it's such a rare rock. There's very little of it worldwide, and I'll get more into that in a minute. Our serpentinite was formed some 420 million years ago. That's North America on the left, with the arrow indicating that North America in those days was moving eastward. Nowadays it's moving westward, but in those days it was moving eastward. And that thing in the ocean out there is an offshore island arc, and think of a volcanic island arc, and think of Japan. It was very similar to Japan. It was big and it had a lot of volcanoes, and it was moving towards North America with a plate, the North American oceanic part of the North American plate subducting underneath it. So the oceanic bedrock worldwide is mostly made of a rock type called peridotite, and peridotite consists mainly of 2 minerals, olivine and pyroxenes. Olivine is quite beautiful. Pyroxenes have their charm too. And peridotite is metamorphosed into, so peridotite is an igneous rock. It's metamorphosed into serpentinite with combination of seawater and a certain amount of pressure. And it forms serpentinite plus heat and some other things, which I'll talk about in a bit. So on back to our timeline, serpentinite forms, it forms anywhere on the ocean bottom, but oftentimes near a subducting plate. So by 370 million years ago, that island arc had smashed up against North America and made North America bigger. And there's serpentinite that was, and lots of other things that were on the ocean bottom and various metamorphic processes, subject to various metamorphic processes, it was kind of like a big car wreck. There were lots of little pieces, and some of them were smashed upwards as this mountain range formed from the collision between the offshore island arc and the continent. And we had big mountains here in those days, like Himalaya-sized mountains. By 340 million years ago, North America was heading the other way. Well, no, it was still heading eastward, but something else was coming to smash into it, and that something else was Gondwanaland, and specifically the Africa part of Gondwanaland, the part of Gondwanaland that later turned into Africa. So erosion has been taking place, and this mountain range is getting smaller. 320 million years ago, Africa smashed into North America, made an even bigger mountain range because Africa is really big, and there's lots of erosion still taking place. Then 200 million years ago, Africa starts retreating and rift valleys are opening.
How do you do that?
You did. What's going on? Somebody's not muted.
I'm gonna look and see if anybody is not muted. If you are not muted, okay, there we go. If your title is Zoom user, you are not muted. I just muted you. Okay, I'm gonna ask you to leave.
Uh-oh, we're being crashed.
Okay, all right, I think they're gone. Okay, I'll make sure that doesn't happen again. Thanks.
Okay. So by the time the continents are splitting up again and rift valleys are forming that will later become the ocean, the mountain range has been very much eroded away by erosion. And by now, the serpentinite is finally exposed at the surface. And did you notice that Africa left a little piece of itself behind? That piece is southern New Jersey, way underneath all the sand. The serpentine that's exposed at the surface took all those hundreds of millions of years to get there. Probably as India right now is smashing into Asia, forming the Himalayas, there's almost certainly chunks of serpentinite, and by chunks I mean, county-sized chunks inside that mountain range, and all we need is 400 million years, and we'll have Serpentine Barrens there too. So I mentioned that peridotite plus seawater plus a certain amount of pressure yields serpentinite and heat, and it also yields a few other things. One is even more pressure, because serpentinite is basically hydrated peridotite, which means that it's absorbed water, and in absorbing water, it gets bigger. And serpentinite gives off the formation of what is called by geologists serpentinization, gives off a lot of heat, but it also gives off hydrogen, molecular hydrogen, methane, and other organic materials. And this is a little sidetrack, but I enjoy this little fun fact about serpentinite, which is that for one thing, as serpentinite forms, it can form these there's one called the Lost City, these hydrothermal vents. And these aren't the hydrothermal vents that you may be familiar with that are called black smokers that have great big colonies of tube worms and so on. These are a different process, and they are formed by serpentinization at the bottom of the ocean, and they're finding more and more of them. And they are chemotrophic ecosystems independent of solar energy. It's dark down there, and yet these are teeming with life forms. And those life forms don't depend on photosynthesis, as all other life forms do on Earth, either directly or indirectly. They are getting their energy from serpentinization, and they're getting their parts from this hydrogen, this methane. Actually, the hydrogen is a source of energy, and so forth. And the same thing, there's almost 100% certainty among astronomers, is happening on Enceladus, which is one of the moons of Saturn. And there's a subsurface ocean. There's ice on top and an ocean underneath, and there are these vents. And what's coming out of the vents indicates that serpentinization is happening there. And it looks like it's also happening on Europa and Ganymede and others. And Europa and Ganymede, as you may be aware, have more ocean volume than the Earth. So here on Earth, the fundamental, or the base of the food chain, the food web, are these bacteria that are chemotrophic rather than being photosynthetic, producing energy, and all of their consumers. And here on Earth, some of their consumers are these, and some of their consumers are these. And I always like to think that maybe when we finally send a spaceship down into the oceans of Europa, we're going to find similar critters to these. These guys are, by the way, so small as to be almost microscopic. So back to North America. Here is a map of all of the ultramafic bedrock in North America. And this was done by the US Geological Survey. Interestingly, because ultramafic rock is an ideal kind of place to pump pure carbon dioxide underground, because it reacts with the ultramafic bedrock and is permanently made a part of the rock. So if and when we start building giant plants to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and try to put it in a place where it's not going to come back, the USGS thought we ought to map this kind of bedrock. And notice in the east, it's almost all of it is in these three ecoregions, the Piedmont proper, the Blue Ridge, and the northern Piedmont. There's some up into New England as well. And there are no serpentine grasslands. There are serpentine communities up there, and on into the Maritimes and Newfoundland as well. But serpentine grasslands only exist in these three ecoregions. And in fact, they only exist in two spots, or one spot in the Blue Ridge, one spot in the Piedmont proper in North Carolina and Georgia. And the rest of them are all in Maryland and Pennsylvania. So they actually cover less than 9% of the total serpentinite bedrock area. So let's close in on this region here. There used to be one in Delaware, as you can see, but it was destroyed by development. And in fact, that's the case with most of them. Here is a map of the locations of all of the extant Serpentine Barrens, minus the one in North Carolina and the one in Georgia. And you can see the circles represent the barrens that used to exist and were rich and full of interesting plant life and unique communities, but they no longer are there. And it's primarily because of development and secondarily because of neglect, basically. And we'll get into that in a minute. Down in Maryland, Soldier's Delight is actually the largest single serpentine barren. There's one called Bear Hills, which is a project that I'm working on right now. Up here, we have these three are managed as nature preserves, and some of the other ones are beginning to be managed as nature preserves. And then the biggest aggregation of barrens, total area, is in the state line barrens. And you may have heard some of these names. And if you'd like to visit some barrens, these are excellent choices. So what connects the rare bedrock type to the rare ecosystem? Well, as you can imagine, what connects rock to ecosystems? Soils. Serpentine soils are unique. And look, in that soil core, you can see that the B horizon, in fact, is green. It's sometimes orange. They're very, very high in magnesium, and they're very, very low in calcium. And this poses a major problem for plants. They're also very high in some heavy metals, principally nickel, but also chromium and some others. And these are bedrock. These are totally bedrock effects. The high magnesium, it's interesting that the high magnesium and the low calcium would be a problem for plants because they need magnesium. The central ion of the chlorophyll molecule is an ion of magnesium. But it turns out that when this imbalance exists, plants are thrown into a tizzy, except for a very few. The systems are very low in nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium for the most part. And that's due to biological activity because it's inhibited by those mineral conditions. You have lower production or storage of those other minerals. And contrary to what people believe when they look at them and think they must be a xeric community, in fact, there are hydric, mesic, and xeric components of all serpentine barrens. So a good question is, I mentioned before that only 9% of the serpentinite bedrock is covered with barrens. Why not 100%? Well, it's because we live in the forest zone, and there are 10 to 20 tons per acre per year of forest leaf litter put down by our forests, which we love, and that makes humus, and humus presents a physical barrier and a dilution effect to the mineral imbalances in serpentine soils. And trees move the nutrients laterally, so they're taking it up here, they're moving it out to their leaves, and they're dropping it farther and farther into the barrens, just burying them in organic matter enriched soil, and pretty soon they completely disappear, which happens a lot. So that raises the question, why are there any serpentine barrens? Why haven't they all been covered with forest long ago? Well, the answer is tree killing disturbances, and that's the only reason why we have serpentine barrens still. Not only grazing, but mining within historical times have denuded a lot of the serpentine barrens areas of, I shouldn't say denuded, but greatly reduced the amount of organic matter in the soil, or the amount of organic soil, promoting erosion and so forth. Serpentinite actually was a big mining magnet. Was mined for building stone, as I mentioned. Also corundum, it was once the world's leading producer of corundum and chromite. And there are inclusions within the serpentinite of non-serpentinite rock that called pegmatites that have feldspar that were also mined. So the question comes up, serpentine barrens, I claim, have been there for probably hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And so before livestock mining and grazing, what killed the trees? Well, you guessed it, I'm guessing you guessed it. And where did that come from? It came from us. And who are us? Us are human beings who arrived here about 15,000 years ago. And we have much evidence from various core analysis, palynological evidence showing the sudden dominance of grasses and the sudden appearance of a lot of charcoal that people have been burning here for thousands of years. Spottily, not everywhere, but here and there, and luckily for us in the Serpentine Barrens region. And why did people burn the landscape? Why was it such a common thing? It wasn't accidental. They burned to promote the growth of berries and other wild plant foods. So we have, if you burn an area, you get a lot of raspberries and blackberries and blueberries and huckleberries and strawberries, etc. Other useful wild plants. It improves the habitat for edge species. And as we all know, deer are edge species. And that was one of the primary protein sources for people for the last 15,000 years in our area, turkey, etc. Ease of hunting, it's easier to hunt when you don't have a shrubby understory. Ease of travel, pest control. People actually burn to get rid of ticks and whatnot. And also I would guess homeland security. In other words, you can see people coming from farther away if you have an understory that's low. But what about the millions of years before then? You know, the average lifespan of a species may be 1 million or 2 years. These species have been around for a long time. They're certainly more than 15,000 years old for the most part. What about before then? How did the trees get killed off and spots and open areas exist? You know, at least half of our native flora are heliophytes. And that makes sense if you're on the beach or if you're in the alpine tundra, but in the forest area, which the northern Piedmont was mostly forested at the time of European settlement, how do you have so many species, such a high diversity of heliophytes that depend on open habitats with no trees? And it's because, as we know, eastern elk were much more abundant in those days, and they have the capability of keeping areas open once the trees are killed, and they would eat baby trees, etc. And we have these things that came and went depending on the climate change. We had musk oxen down this way and caribou at some points, and other times eastern elk and white-tailed deer. But what people don't, I think, appreciate quite enough is that our fauna in this region, our megafauna and our mesofauna, were quite more diverse than they are today. That's an understatement. We had giant horse, and we had another horse, and we had another musk oxen, and we had a stag moose, which is bigger than the common moose or the present day moose. We had another deer. We had giant beavers, which were the size of black bears. They were pretty good, plant eaters. Three peccary species, a couple of tapered species, and the giant armadillo. But are these critters enough to create large open spaces? Because they don't really eat adult trees. They just eat seedlings, and they keep places in grass for a long period of time. Well, we also had a couple of different giant ground sloths, and we also had 3 different species of proboscideans, all in our area here. And of course, when they want to eat a tree, they just knock it down. This is one of my favorite African proverbs. And in fact, this may be true metaphorically about the relationship between the ruling classes and ruled classes in human beings. But in fact, it's backwards when it comes to ecosystems. When elephants fight and make love, it's the trees that suffer. The grass is just fine. So let me talk a bit about the Serpentine Barrens flora. There are few endemics. Here, there are other serpentine communities in the world, say in the tropics and in California, places with milder climates, which aren't glaciated every couple of 100,000 years for the last 2 million years, have more endemics. But our area, of course, had very, very bad weather about 20 times over the last 2 million years. And so didn't really have time for the production of endemics in a small community, in a small island-like community like Serpentine Barrens. But we do have a few. One is the Serpentine aster. And it's globally rare, but only threatened in Pennsylvania because it, where it exists is really abundant. And that's its overwintering rosette, which is actually evergreen. We also have an endemic subspecies, Cerastium velutinum variety villicissumum, which only occurs, as far as I know, in 3 spots, 3 Serpentine Barrens, 2 in Pennsylvania, 1 in, actually, yeah, maybe just 2 spots, 1 in Pennsylvania, 1 in Maryland. You can see it earned its name. And a little mollusk called Reed's Tychostomum, which also lives in only about 3 or 4 places. And that's pretty much it for the plant endemics that we know of. What it does have is many disjunct edge of range and habitat specialist species, species whose ranges are archipelagos, basically, of widely dispersed island habitats. Sandplain Gerardia is a federally listed species. Used to be in Pennsylvania, but no longer. Here's some state-listed species of sedges that are only found in Serpentine Barrens in our local area. Small's ragwort. Curtis's milkwort. This is more common farther south, but up here it's only in the Serps. Philadelphia wood lily is extirpated in Maryland. It's in fair shape in Pennsylvania. The biggest population I know of is in a little Serpentine Barren 3 miles from where I sit. Heller's witchgrass. These are just a few examples. Coral milkweed, sometimes called horsetail milkweed for obvious reasons. This is a little succulent plant in the, I can never think of the name of that family. It's the same family. It's all succulents. Okay, besides those, there's an intermixture of species usually found in wetlands. And I mentioned before that this is not a xeric community. It looks like one because most of the species that live there are highly tolerant of lots of bad conditions, so-called bad conditions. And so, it appears that resistance to drought or resistance to mineral nutrient unavailability predisposes a plant to be resistant to all of the things that serpentine soils throw at plants. So we have, I mentioned before, the serpentine seeps. They are generally dominated by tufted hairgrass, which is a wetland species. Again, a disjunct from farther north. This is a cool season grass. A lot of the grasses that are specialists on serpentine are warm season. This is cool season. Swamp thistle is common. You can't even tell where the line can be drawn between a wetland and a non-wetland on Serpentine Barrens, because these species are all intermixed. It's another one, it's common. And there are many habitat specialists and conservative species in the sense of having high floristic quality index. So we have moss, phlox, Barron's chickweed, New Jersey tea. Biggest population I've ever seen of New Jersey tea is at that same spot 3 miles from where I sit in a Serpentine Barren. Jared knows about this because he's grown out some plants from seed from this population. Lots of rose pink. Every Serpentine Barren almost has rose pink. Arrow leaf violet. You can see here the serpentinite stones. They're all their green splendor. Purple milkweed, many sites. And of course, not just plants, but animals. There are lots of listed animals, or tracked, I should say, animals that we haven't started listing invertebrates in Pennsylvania for the most part, except for mussels. But there are a lot of species that are tracked that should be listed or will be listed. One is the Juniper hairstreak. This picture was taken by Doug Tallamy at one of the barrens while I stood there and watched him. And this apparently only lives in places where eastern red cedar has been steadily for thousands of years. And that's his theory anyway. Rough green snake, which is associated with common greenbrier. It actually crawls through the greenbrier and you can't really see it because it looks like a greenbrier stem. And the biggest population of this in Pennsylvania is in one of the Serpentine Barrens. You see the critter in this picture? It's a dot-lined white. Well, it's really good at camouflaging itself against a twig. And this is what it looks like when it metamorphoses. This is one of the cutest moths I've ever seen. Reminds me of a monkey. So here's an example, just a typical example of the history of Serpentine Barren. This, the first aerial photo was taken in this region in 1937. Here's what it looked like. This is the Unionville Barrens, which is now protected and managed. By 1958, the forest was creeping in. By 2010, we were down to only about less than 10 acres from a start of in 1937. Who knows what it was like before then? 1937, over 60 acres. And so what we're having is a dynamic that's taking place that is kind of catastrophic to this ecosystem. We have habitat contraction with trees growing in with the lack of the kind of tree killing disturbance that's needed to keep that from happening. And we have the loss of entire sites primarily because of development, but for other reasons as well. And those result in habitat contraction, results in shrinkage of local populations and loss of entire sites, shrinkage of regional populations of all of these species that depend on the Serpentine Barrens. The rescue effect is when a population gets into trouble, either is lost or because of some disaster at one site, or inbreeding depression makes it unable to continue thriving. And a piece of pollen or a seed or other thing, a colonist will arrive from another population nearby and rescue the whole thing. And with sites winking out of existence, you get that rescue effect is much, much less. Then you get lower genetic diversity on sites. And that can lead to inbreeding depression, and it also leads to lower evolutionary potential. So if a new disease or a new insect or a new whatever comes in, that's a new parasite or a new predator of the species, there's less likelihood that there will be genetic variation in the population, a genetic variant in the population that can withstand this new pressure, this new stress, and have more babies than everybody else, therefore evolving to deal with the stress. And of course, you have random disasters coming all the time, and not so random disasters like global climate change. And then you have the gradual extirpation of species. And some of these sites that are so much smaller than they were only 100 years ago or less, they're probably, some of the species are the walking dead in a way. They're there, but they're not viable. They're not going to last. And examples of that are colic root. We had lots of colic root and a lot of our Serpentine Barrens. It's completely disappeared from Pennsylvania, and I think from the Maryland Barrens as well. Indian paintbrush, you just don't see it anymore. And all of the records show that it was once there. What a beautiful plant. So back in the 90s, I started a research project, got funding to begin a conservation biology research on Serpentine Barrens, and specifically on the restoration of serpentine grasslands, which are the richest of the Serpentine Barren subcommunities. And my first attempt was a 10-year study at Nottingham Barrens with 8 experimental restoration treatments in former grasslands that had succeeded to forest. Here they are: tree thinning followed by herbiciding, tree thinning followed by mowing, tree thinning followed by low intensity burning, clear cutting and low intensity burning followed by 2 years of goat browsing, clear cutting followed by moderate intensity burning, clear cutting and severe drought followed by high intensity burning, clear cutting and mechanical removal of the top layer of soil organic matter, and low intensity burning from the grasslands across the forest grassland ecotone. So
Okay, so did we lose Roger?
He go.
I thought it was just me.
Oh, we gotta freeze. Okay. We'll be back. Hang on.
You guys just want to talk, or?
Sure. Yeah. Who said that? Okay. All right. So I just shot an email over to Roger and asking him to log back on. I think his internet was unstable. Okay. If everybody would just.
Hey, I just got a text from Roger that he says his network is down. So, I don't know exactly how long that will take, but maybe we should talk amongst ourselves for a bit. I'll send him a text back.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Okay, great. So my question would be to everybody, anybody have any projects? This is sort of a general one. Anybody have any projects, restoration projects that they're undertaking right now that are fresh and new, and that might be even better relevant to this talk. I know that there's some burning and stuff going on at some sites. Anybody want to pipe in on a project they're doing?
I'm back, by the way.
Oh, okay, never mind. We don't have to talk amongst ourselves. Great.
I'm so sorry. My system is unstable, and I've done everything I can, but boy, I can't wait to get back to in-person meetings.
Yeah, all of us, I think, feel that.
Right.
Why don't you go ahead and share your screen? We were just talking amongst ourselves, and I'll give you a minute.
Okay, so I was talking about the goats, and indeed, as it turns out, oh boy, goats do love greenbrier. This goat looks like it's in somewhat of a bliss. One of my students feeding her by hand. But here's the result. After 2 years of goat browsing, we got no greenbrier, but we got 100% cover of common ragweed, not a serpentine grassland. So here's what's worked. Let me give you a rundown of just a quick rundown of what really has, well, no, this was another treatment. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Clear cutting and mechanical removal of the top layer of soil organic matter. That was a brilliant idea that was came up with my postdoc host at the University of Pennsylvania. Never would have occurred to me, I don't think. So we clear cut, which we did a lot of anyway, but then we used front end loaders or backhoes to scrape the top 6 inches, 5-6 inches of soil organic matter that had built up, usually underneath a whole big thicket of greenbrier. And I always like to think of what historical process are we trying to mimic with our stewardship activities, and particularly with our restoration activities. And what is the historical process that we're mimicking here with this removal of adult trees? Well, who removed adult trees for the last how many millions of years in our area? And in fact, some of our equipment kind of looks like a megafauna. And as you may know, in Africa, in places where proboscideans still exist, the areas where with lots of rainfall, just like we have, with continuous forest cover over most places, where these elephants exist, there are big openings with lots and lots of heliophytes growing in them. So soil organic matter reduction, that treatment, what is the historical process we're mimicking there? Well, during severe drought, when you burn, as you may well know, it burns right down into the soil and burns away the humus. It may smolder for weeks, burning down the humus and triggering a pulse of erosion. And this is the kind of result we got with organic matter, soil organic matter removal. Just terrific. I mean, 100% native serpentine barren characteristic species came in. 100% cover. No non-natives survived longer than the first year or two. So we wanted to try that severe drought business, but how do you do severe drought? Well, we got a grant and we bought 3 big greenhouses, 100-foot by 30-foot greenhouses, and we put them up over an area and we let it be droughtful, completely free of rain for 2.5 months. And that's a pretty severe drought. Then we went out there, took those greenhouses down in the morning and burned in the late morning. And it was basically like burning a brush pile, because we actually put some of the stuff that we cut out of there, the slash, back in. And what did we get? We got that smoldering, we got that severe burn. And in fact, we did get duff reduction. This is what I call a Duff Meter. And a Duff meter is a big nail that's pushed flush to the surface before the fire. And then after the fire, you measure them all, and then you calculate how many tons per acre or tons per hectare of humus that you lost. And this was the only burn, the only one of the many, many, many burns that we did out there that actually produced any Duff reduction whatsoever. Duff normally is so saturated with moisture that it doesn't burn. What the most interesting result of that study, both of the high severity burn after a severe drought and the Duff reduction, the mechanical removal of soil organic matter, was that we documented a sequence of, what's it called? Succession. I'm losing my nouns. A successional sequence that had never been seen before or never been documented before. One of the first things that came in like gangbusters was the annual warm season grasses that are native. Philadelphia panic grass, church mouse 3-on, poverty dropseed, slender crabgrass. Yes, we do have a native crabgrass, in case you weren't aware. They came in like crazy and covered those sites really fast. Other forbs that were annuals also came in, orange grass and rock sandwort, world milkwort and partridge pea. It's fun discovering something new. So we've applied this soil organic matter reduction method over large areas since then. And here I'm going to show you a panorama of the largest area so far. It was something like close to 10 acres of soil organic matter reduction, which we got a grant to do. And it turned out really, really well. I don't have any photos to show you of how it looks now, but what's come in is mostly native. And how many times do you get a native response of mostly native species to soil disturbance around here? Well, if you're on serpentinite, you've got it made. Another method that we're using primarily for maintenance rather than restoration is prescribed fire. And what historical process? Well, that's real obvious. We also, around one of the Serpentine Barrens, have erected a deer exclusion fence. You know, it turns out that hunting is not an efficient way to mimic the historical process here, which is unrestricted hunting by really good hunters. And we don't have that so much anymore. And very few deer populations have been, if any, have been reduced to ecological carrying capacity, historical ecological carrying capacity by hunting alone. So we do culling if you can get a permit from the state, but a deer exclusion fence really does the trick. Another management method is population augmentation of species of greatest conservation need. So we pull seeds from one part of a site and plant them in another part of the site so we have better distribution, or we pull seeds from a nearby site to a site and transplant them to a site where the species has been extirpated. In this case, they're pulling Bouteloua curtopendula, the side oats grama. And we have partners, in this case, the Mount Cuba Center. We've also worked with Bowman's Hill Wildlife Sanctuary to grow these things out into plugs, and then we put them back in. And the historical process is the rescue effect that I talked about before. So Eastern Serpentine Barrens really are a world-class network of biodiversity conservation areas. There's 10 globally rare and endangered species, more than 100 state-listed species, maybe well over 100, including the insects and everybody else. They are a globally rare natural community and ecosystem. irreplaceable resources. How do you manage something like that? What a responsibility that is. I mean, that's huge. Stakes are really high. It's very important to do stewardship right. And yet, no one knows for sure how to succeed. It's not something that people have been doing for very long. And the cost of actual research projects with lots of replication and et cetera is prohibitive. So how do you handle this kind of stuff? And I believe that the way to go, and I think lots of you know this already or agree with me on this already, and we'll talk about it later, is the paradigm of adaptive ecosystem management. So what that consists of, if you're not familiar with it, it's truly evidence-based. It's real scientific management. Science, oftentimes people pay lip service to scientific management because they say their management is science-based, but in fact it's based on, you know, some people's best judgment, and no proof is required. You just apply what you think you know from science and then see what happens. With adaptive ecosystem management, first you have a desired condition analysis, which takes into account the site's history, the ecological dynamics of that particular set of communities, and the best reference sites for that particular kind of set of communities. And from that, you come up with, this is key, quantitative indicators of success or progress at least. And then you do an existing conditions inventory in terms of the same quantitative indicators. Then a restoration management plan consisting of the best scientific judgment on how to close the gap between existing and desired conditions. Then execute management actions designed like scientific experiments, and that's another key. You compare alternative methods or manipulated versus unmanipulated areas, whatever is appropriate to your particular system. Then do quantitative monitoring of indicator responses, those same quantitative indicators that you came up with in desired conditions analysis and measured in your existing conditions inventory. Analyze the data, interpret the data, compare trends and indicators with your benchmarks. Then, and this is what makes it adaptive, routine, periodic, self-correcting feedback. New approaches if called for by the data. Just for an example, this is again back to that same site, the Unionville Serpentine Barrens. This is from my plan, the desired conditions, a big list of them. Then each one is associated with at least one metric, in many cases more than one metric that can be measured. Then we have best judgment. What are the target values? What consists of poor? What consists of fair? What consists of good? What consists of excellent? And then you measure what's there now, and you measure what the change is since the last time you monitored. So here's one example of a metric is alpha richness of native serpentine grassland species, or evenness. Those are the two main components of diversity, and you don't species diversity. And there's no sense in combining those two into something like the Shannon index. They should be measured separately, because why not? They're apples and oranges. Another one is herbaceous serpentine grassland plant species turnover, which is beta diversity among different patches within a site. All of these things are important. High connectivity, low fragmentation, and that can be measured on GIS using certain metrics. And another one is picking indicator species. You know, one of our species is the roundleaf fameflower, and there are others. And what's important, that you have discrete clusters, because for insurance purposes within a site, and total number of stems are good metrics for those kinds of things. So the bottom lines of the research that I've done is that there's no simple magic bullet to reverse the grassland decline. Effective restoration and maintenance requires a combination of things. Restoration, you need to remove the forest canopy. You need mechanical removal of greenbrier invasives and soil organic matter in selected places where it's appropriate. Population augmentation and maintenance requires regular prescribed fire and patches at varied intervals. People ask me who manage grasslands, what is the right return interval for fire? Well, the right return interval is some areas should have it more often than other areas, and some areas even more often. And so vary the footprint from one burn to another, so that some areas are burned every once in a while, and some areas are burned much more regularly. There are different species in these communities require different conditions, and those conditions, the full gamut of those conditions can only be provided if you provide different levels of disturbance intensity. And adaptive management monitoring is absolutely key. It's often the one thing that's cut when funds are limited, and funds are always limited. So I wanted to just a shout out here at the end to lots of partnerships. This couldn't happen. This management at this scale cannot happen without partnerships, and not just management, but protection. As you all know, I have Pennsylvania Natural Heritage Program in both yellow and green, because here in Pennsylvania, we have a hybrid natural heritage program that's partly run by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which is a nonprofit organization, and partly by the state agencies. But many state level, county level, and nonprofit level organizations are required for all this to succeed. And we've had great success in recruiting help from these organizations, and things are moving pretty well on a lot of these sites. That's my presentation. And let's unmute ourselves, or however you're going to run this, Rachel, and have some discussion.
Well, thank you, Roger. That was really great. And I appreciated you going through the process of how you came up with plans and your management process. I'm curious to kick it off with what you ended with, which was how did these groups come together? What was the impulse? And then how did people kind of fall in line to support the project, and how did that work?
Really great question. I've been working on this since 1981, and virtually no Serpentine Barrens were protected at that time, much less managed well or managed at all. It's a very incremental process, and it involved, recruiting one organization after another. It was kind of kicked off in Pennsylvania by the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy got the state, began to convince people at the state level that it was a state level thing that needed to be done. In Maryland, the Nature Conservancy has been involved too, but the Department of Natural Resources, actually, because they have the biggest single site, the Soldier's Delight Serpentine Barren near Baltimore, they bought the site and protected it long ago, longer ago than I know how these things, got started. But I know there was a book written about the Soldier's Delight Serpentine Barrens back in the, I believe it was back in the early 80s, that helped kick things off. It's kind of a snowballing effect. I've seen so many people falling into the belief that these systems are really special and that they need special protection, and they just one group after another has hopped on board of their own accord. Once things reached a kind of a threshold level momentum. And there, not to say that everything is all roses. There are some sites that are world-class sites that have lots and lots of endangered species that have no protection whatsoever. And yet even those sites, oftentimes volunteer groups have gotten together, been mustered by the Nature Conservancy or others to get the landowner's permission to do some kind of management in the meantime, hoping that they'll be protected one day. There's a group at the State Line Serpentine Barrens called Friends of the State Line Serpentine Barrens, and they have done a tremendous amount of work, and have actually, I think, been instrumental in the state finally giving up the idea that all of their natural areas needed to be protected from anything and everything, well, from any kind of management whatsoever, to realizing that some natural areas do need to be managed, and Serpentine Barrens are one of those. And the Nature Conservancy had turned over one of the largest Serpentine Barrens in Pennsylvania to the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, Bureau of Forestry, and they resisted burning it, for applying any fire there at all for decades, and finally came around. And it's a hard process, and it's one step at a time, and it's persuading people that are key people in various organizations that this is worthwhile them spending resources on. Does that answer your question at all? It's very vague, I know.
No, that's great. And so everybody, if you look at the chat, which if you don't know how to find it, if you just go across the bottom of your screen and kind of hover over there, one of the icons is chat. So if you would like to ask a question in the chat, you could just type it in there. I put Roger's website address in there, and so you can check out his website. He has a lot of scholarly articles posted there and other information. So questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute and go ahead and ask some questions.
Hi, Roger. What do you think the seed sources are when you do like the soil scraping or you burn off inches of duff? Where are those seeds coming from that are recolonizing?
That's a great question. Every time we have done the soil organic matter reduction treatment, it has always been right next to an area of intact grassland, ancient grassland. So there are seeds coming in from there. And I believe in the case of the experiment where we burned into the duff, I'm pretty sure the seed bank was annihilated. But in most cases, well, in all the cases of mechanical removal, I think some of the seed bank is still there. And a lot of these heliophyte species in particular are long-lived seed in the seed bank. The heliophyte, it's interesting, that seems as though, I don't know whether somebody has some evidence to refute or support this, who's online here today, but it seems as though ant dispersal is one of the, if not the most important dispersal mechanism for forest floor herbaceous species, and not so much for these open grassland herbaceous species. They seem to be mostly wind dispersed or animal dispersed or who knows what. So so they travel perhaps farther and wider, and we have gotten good. It just astounded me, that 10-acre area that I showed you, at the remote end of the 10 acres from the ancient grassland, we got the ancient grassland species popping right up. And I suspect they were already there and got left behind when the soil organic matter reduction process is really messy, as you can imagine. So there's lots of spillage.
If I could ask something, you mentioned New Jersey tea. I used to live down in North Carolina and Durham, in the Piedmont down there, and I discovered a lot of remnants of grasslands.
Yeah.
along old roads and so forth. And but they didn't have listed species, so people weren't very interested in them, even though they had tremendous diversity.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've encountered issues with that, like limitations in valuing remnants based on listed species, when you have, one listed species giving more value than like 100 species of that actually form a coherent plant community.
That's great that you bring that up. I am working on a research project right now, which is funded by the Pennsylvania Department of Conservation and Natural Resources on mafic communities. Did I mention in my talk that serpentinite is an ultramafic rock? And ultramafic means very, very high in magnesium and also in iron. And that kind of presupposes low in calcium and all the other effects that serpentinite has. There's not that many kinds of rock that are classed as ultramafic, but there's a whole nother set of rocks that are classed as mafic, and you probably know about those because they're pretty common in the parts of New Jersey, I guess mainly in the Piedmont of New Jersey, one of which is diabase. Other ones are basalt and metabasalt and metadiabase and mafic gneiss and some others. And I'm doing a research project on those communities, how to protect and conserve them, and what differentiates them from other communities. And we find a lot of those super rich areas along roads that don't necessarily have listed species, but I've started to use the coefficients of conservatism to rank those communities, and they don't require a species to be listed to have a large and a high value of in the floristic quality index. And these sites are really important from a metapopulation perspective for some of these species, and would be great sites to collect seed from to replenish species in protected areas, for example. Does that address your question at all? I think I agree that communities need to be more widely recognized, and we're working towards that with this this research project. If we define a rich mafic meadow community in Pennsylvania, then that becomes a part of the official Pennsylvania community classification system. Then it will be eligible for protection on its own. It'll be eligible for state funding for protection on its own without regard to whether it's full of listed species or not.
Oh, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Hi, Roger. I'm curious, not to go off topic from your presentation, but
Oh, please do.
I mean, it's related. I'm just curious what your thoughts are, how much you know about, or what your thoughts are on management in the New Jersey Pine Barrens.
Wow.
In 10 words or less. No, I'm only kidding.
Well, I think it's really important. I'm not an expert in the coastal pine barrens at all, and I visit often whenever I can. I was there during the. I've been hiking the pine barrens during the pandemic. Some great communities there, and I've talked with people who are very familiar with them and have strong opinions about what should be done and what should be done differently from what is being done. And I just don't have enough knowledge to weigh in general terms. I might be able to weigh in specific terms if you're talking about managing the dwarf pines or managing the cedar swamps or anything like that. There's a lot going on over there that's really important stuff. That was not an answer. I apologize.
I guess I'm thinking generally, and not to put you on the spot, but just your general thoughts, like the general concept that there's too many stems of pitch pine over large areas. I mean, past prescribed burning has in many areas led to, pitch pine over huckleberry, with lots of stems of pitch pine, and obviously there's other people that have been pushing for, more broadly opening and making it much more barren of trees than it is now.
Well, one thing I do have to say about that is that I feel very strongly in the adaptive management planning process with a desired condition, with a very thorough desired condition analysis being done using all the historical records that are available, including historical botanical records. I happen to know that, what was his name? He was Linnaeus's student, a Finnish guy who Linnaeus sent over to Pericalm, after whom Kalmia is named, way back in the 1700s. He was a great documenter of species composition of various communities. He lived in New Jersey while he was here. There are other records, and I imagine somebody has done this already. I don't know, but to come up with quantitative goals for the kinds of communities and the richness of those communities and the presence of certain species and catering to those species needs as well as the entire community's needs. A desired conditions analysis is really a great tool for kind of clarifying for everybody why you want to do what you want to do and what the important things are to conserve, so that you can design your program around those. I mean, what combination of open forest versus closed forest is the goal, and why? Those are the kinds of questions that need to be answered, and I don't know whether they have been or not in a systematic fashion.
Yeah, I don't do a lot of work in the Pine Barrens generally. I mean, but yeah, I'm sure that I don't know of that ever occurring, that anyone ever taking a whack at it like that.
Right. When there's controversy over what the desired condition is, then actual evidence, historical evidence, and various other kinds of evidence need to be weighed and presented in a way that people can refer to it and say, look, this is why I feel the way I do about how much open forest there should be in the Pine Barrens, or that we have too much or too little or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, as you can imagine, there's different interests want the thing they want, and then
Right.
They hand wave at
Right.
the rationale, the historical justification for it.
Hand waving was the predecessor to desired condition analysis. It's still very much used.
Roger, this is a question maybe just for fun, but outside of the coastal plains, so maybe Piedmont and Highlands and Ridge and Valley and so on, sometimes one encounters an area that seems to have some clues that it might be a remnant of a more open habitat, but it's in many ways passes for surrounding forest communities. And I was wondering if there's any species that you might see as sort of indicator species that pique your interest when you do encounter them in the field in forested communities, that might suggest to you that this either represents a degraded remnant of a more open habitat or has some restoration potential in terms of being converted into something like a glade or a barrens, or another community that would host heliophyte plant species.
That's a great question. I don't have something that I would point to in a closed forest that would indicate the probability that a site was open, except for one actually on serpentinite outcrops. When I see an area of upland forest where the understory is a greenbrier thicket, I think that was probably open at one time. But that's pretty specific, I think, to serpentine openings. But what I do feel is strong evidence of a site having been open is an opening that exists now, and maybe much smaller than it used to be, having a collection of species, more than one heliophyte of high floristic quality index value, or rare in some sense heliophytes, because it takes a long time for an island of open habitat here in the forest region of Eastern North America to accumulate multiple species that are kind of rare and only live in openings. I think a strong distinction needs to be made between early successional species that occupy openings and later successional meadow species and grassland species. Not all, I think for too long, places like Serpentine Barrens and Mayfield Glades have been called early successional. Well, they're not. They're absolutely not. They've been here for thousands of years, and they don't have the species that are early successional. They may have a few, but they're not dominated by common ragweed, and they're not dominated by all of those other species that we associate with early successional openings. They have their own flora, and when you see a meadow with a bunch of those species that are not in your typical, recovering farm field or whatever, you got to know that you've got to infer that site has been open for a very, very long time, and probably was much bigger at some point. Also, look at your early aerial photos, the 1930s and even 1920s aerial photos in some areas. Those are invaluable planning tools for people who are in the business of native meadow restoration or rehabilitation.
I'm really glad that you went there. There seems to be this like over-reliance on the idea of succession and calling anything open early successional, and it ticks me off. And there's been a raft of recent presentations saying that, oh, if you clear forest, you get early succession, and then year one it's like annuals, and by year three you got orchids popping out of every filing cabinet, and there's no recognition that you have conservative forest communities and conservative open communities. And just because open habitats can be very diverse, it doesn't mean that the broken up pavement next to Walmart is going to be popping out like hyper diversity, nor necessarily will a clear cut just in like a typical or average upland forest suddenly become so much more diverse just because you cut it all down and it's quote unquote early successional. It's a weird paradigm, this whole successional thing. I don't know, I'm kind of commenting, but I'd really be interested in your thoughts about the idea of succession, which sort of seems to be this like farmland into forest, start to finish thing, and how it overlays, if at all, with your idea about barrens and grasslands.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I think we're on the cusp of change, of recognition that there are some valuable communities in our forest region that are non-forest, that are not, the typical, they're not salt marshes, and they're not alpine tundra, and they're not the ones that have been recognized for a long time, or even serpentine barrens, but there are some rich farm fields that have a tremendous number of species of high conservatism values, and we're finding in this study that we're doing on mafic meadows, and not all of them are on mafic rock. And one thing that has kind of blown me away is that the ones that we found that are rich, which are pretty rare, are we dig soil pits, and they have no plow layer. These are farm fields with no plow layer. So they have been hay fields or whatever they've been for a very long time. And, you know, the farmers who hay them have been maintaining these incredibly rich communities without knowing it, except they enjoy the wildflowers. And there might be something there that we have been missing all these years. And I think it's no longer might be something there. There is something there that we've been missing for all these years. And I think it's beginning to be recognized that there are some really special sites that are remnants of our heliophyte flora that was maintained for millions of years by megafauna. It's incredible that some of them have been so lucky as to have persisted to the present day, but there are some.
Hi, Roger. My
Hi,
name's David.
David.
I'm a landscape architect.
We know each other. We know each other. We met
Yeah.
each other on a walk and naturally
true.
led walk to some grasslands a while back.
Yeah, that was great, as usual. My question to you is, I'm often working in urban soils that have some similar qualities, what you're describing in the Serpentine Barrens, heavy metals,
Yeah.
extremely arid at certain points. Are there any plants that, in your mind, kind of stand out, could be adaptably reused in, a more landscaped-like setting?
Oh, absolutely. It depends on what kind of landscape you want. You know, if you wanted to make those into grassland meadows, then the warm season grasses that grow in the Serpentine Barrens are, pretty well adapted to all kinds of miserable conditions, especially little blue stem, and of course broom sedge and some of those others. And but there's quite a number of forbs as well. I'm not a fan of intermixing when you plant an area in meadow species, intermixing the warm season grasses with the forbs and the cool season grasses. And that leads me to another tangent, but there are lots of native cool season grasses that are worth planting or worth thinking about planting too.
Mm-hmm.
But I see too often people intermix the seed, and then the warm season grasses just kill everything else off because they're so they grow so tightly, they have such big fibrous root systems, they don't allow other species to compete very well. So I like a system that I call crop circles, where you put in circles of circular areas of forbs and put the warm season grasses around those. But anyway, there's a lot of forbs that grow on Serpentine Barrens that I think would be wonderful. One is several of the Symphyotricums, the open field asters are good and common on those sites, which means that they're very tolerant of those kinds of soil conditions. Symphyotricum laevi is one. What's the one with the fiddle-shaped lower leaves, or the halberd-shaped lower leaves? I can't think of its name. That's another one. Beautiful blue aster. Another one is Conoclinium celestinum, the blue mist flower, grows on Serpentine Barrens and is apparently really tolerant of what we would call bad soil conditions. I'm trying to think of others. Gray goldenrod. Write me and I'll write me. My
Okay.
address is in my on my website, and I'll send you a list.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then maybe if you're comfortable doing so, perhaps that list could be shared with the whole roundtable group. there's
Sure, I'll
various-
send you a list of,
yeah.
I'll send you a list of characteristic Serpentine Barrens species, which would have most of those on it.
Great.
And maybe that would be able to start at least, and people could come back with questions if you'd like.
I think we could do one more question if anybody has anything. So Roger, I have your website here in the chat, and it's continentalconservation.us.
Right.
So if anybody wants to check that out, please do. And I guess my final question would be, what are you working on this year? What are, one or two projects that you're doing?
Okay. The research project on the Mayfic Meadows is one of them. I'm also working on a desired condition analysis for the Mount Loretto natural area. That's actually called the Mount Loretto unique area on Staten Island. Staten Island does have some really decent high native species diversity communities. Even Staten Islanders tend not to appreciate that. I'm working on a restoration and management plan for the Bear Hills Barrens down near Baltimore. And I'm also working on a revision of a stewardship handbook, wildlands stewardship handbook for managers, and even, well, basically for managers for the whole state of Pennsylvania. It used to be for the southeastern part of Pennsylvania, and we got a grant from the state to expand it to the whole state. And we're working on getting another grant to do the next step, but it's going to be a product that's online and accessible in various modules for people, and hopefully interactive, so people can kind of enter their situation and get tailored reference to tailored or a tailored set of chapters or parts of chapters that will help them with their stewardship decisions.
That's great. What is that called again?
It's right now the book form, which is being revised considerably and is mainly oriented toward southeastern Pennsylvania, is called Land for Life. And there's a subtitle with stewardship in it. But if you look up Land for Life, or go on to Natural Lands website, natlands.org, and you can find your way to it by looking for, I forget what major heading it's under, but you'll find it.
That's great. Roger, thank you for spending what is finally a beautiful day this morning with us. It was a really great talk, and I think everybody took something away from this. Again, continentalconservation.us is Roger's site. Check it out. And so next time we meet will be in, let's see, what is it? In June. We'll be doing some field trips in June, and then October. And I know Eric Gehring is one of the hosts for the fall one, and David is the host for the summer one. So I'll send out that information coming up. In the meantime, keep on posting to the Google group. Everyone's welcome to do so. Anything that comes up relevant to stewardship, whether it's job offering or a question that you have. A lot of times people ask questions and they get answered by this amazing group that is over 10 years strong. So thanks everybody for coming out, and we'll let you know when the recording is up. So I'm gonna end the meeting. Thanks guys.
Thanks for inviting me.
Give a round of applause to Roger. Turn on your videos if you'd like. Wave. Thanks so much, Roger. I really appreciate your time. Bye everybody.
Bye.